Oh, good. That gives me some extra time. Awesome. Quick Bible quiz. We're working on knowing our Bible to get better. I just want to see how good you guys are. What time of day was Adam created? Oh, it was a little before Eve. Why didn't Cain bring an acceptable offering before God?
He wasn't able.
See, some people know their Bible. This is good. This is good. How did Boaz's friends describe him before he was married? He was ruthless. What is the only man-made thing in heaven? The scars on Jesus' hands and feet. How about that? Well, y'all did better than I expected. That was pretty good. How many people, if we just kind of caught people during Oyster Fest or on a regular day, just people going in and out of the store or coming across the bridge, if we polled people, do you think we could find a pretty good number of people who would say, I wish I understood the Bible better? Church people or not church people? I think there's people out there who just think, I wish I understood that thing. Do you think some people, if you said, if you want to understand the Bible better, what's stopping you? Do you think a lot of people would say it's hard to read? It's a challenge. It's like a nut I can't quite crack. I think this is probably the kinds of things that people think. We might not admit it in front of church people, but it's a little challenging, and that's one of the reasons that we're embarking on our journey through the story. Is we want to wrap our arms and our mental arms around this whole thing and get an idea of it. And I think it's interesting. One of the people in the video talked about how isolated all the pieces of the Bible were to her before studying the story. So a lot of people, and this may be you, and that would be okay. That wouldn't be a bad thing. We tend to think, well, there's this, and then there's this, and there's this part and that part, and maybe the books are all separate, and it's difficult for us to see them as a whole. A good comparison would be, you go to an art gallery, and since we're a very refined bunch, I know you all have gone to art galleries. And usually there's a painting, and you ponder it, you think about what it means, admire the technique, and then you go to the next painting. And it's something separate. They might be grouped roughly by historical era or something. But it's one painting, and then there's another painting. But a better way to think of the story of the Bible is a mural. Like, for instance, the famous one on the Sistine Chapel where Michelangelo tried to capture the first arc of the biblical story, where people tend to think of God reaching out to put life into Adam, but that's part of this mural with hundreds of biblical characters, and they're all together because they're all part of one thing. That's a little more like what we're talking about, not individual pieces, but one big spectacular whole, and we want to have an idea of the mural story that the Bible tells us, rather than thinking of those little individual pieces. And truthfully, and again, kind of in our defense, even though the Bible is one story, it's not like stories we're used to. And we've talked about this some. It starts off, Genesis, these are stories. This makes sense. It's pretty linear. Exodus, pretty similar. And then you get into Leviticus, and it's like, wait, what's happening? What is this? And it's all these rules and guidelines and laws. And there's a few stories mixed in there, but it's not really the same as the books before. And then there's a book that has a census in it. I mean, it's a census, and we Do we really need to know that there were 45,650 people in the tribe of Gad? What? It's difficult. It's difficult to wrap our minds around this. So we get these first 5 books, which are all different. There's the law, and then there's another law, and then there's a census, and then there's stories. And then we get into the historical section of the Bible, or in Joshua through Esther, where we get different stories, and they're somewhat linear, but you get into First Kings, and you're talking about Solomon and the demise of dividing the nation, and then Second Kings, it kind of jumps back and forth, and they start giving their kids all these crazy names that are really hard to pronounce. Somebody mentioned that. And then you get to First Chronicles, and you're back at the beginning of the King's stories, and it goes back through the whole thing, and it can be a little confusing. And then there's poetry books, like the Song of Solomon. Where does that come in the story? What's happening? Who are these people? It's confusing. And the book of Job, some people estimate that Job happened somewhere back in Abraham's time. It doesn't line up. It's hard to make sense of this stuff. And in Psalms, we see the work of David, who was way back in Kings. And then the prophetic books. And remember, prophets didn't just it wasn't like there were kings and then there were prophets, right? These prophets lived during times of various kings, but they're all put afterwards. And when in fact, prophets went to kings and tried to tell them what God was speaking. And it's divided into major prophets and minor prophets. And I can save you a couple of years and several $1,000s in tuition to get a seminary degree, and I can tell you, what the difference between major prophets and minor prophets is? How long they are. That's all. The major prophets are major because they went on, and the minor prophets kept it short. That's real. I'm serious. So you get these different books, and it's like, these are the big ones. We'll put those all together, and so you finish up those, and then you go to Hosea, which was 145 years before Daniel, and then you've got some to the northern kingdom, some to the southern kingdom. It's all over the place, and that's difficult. It's difficult to crack that nut. And the New Testament is a little easier, but you might read Matthew, Mark, and Luke if you ever tried to go straight through. And you're like, okay, I'm seeing this. I'm getting a feel for this. Matthew tells the story, and then Mark, and then Luke. It's all pretty similar. And then you read John, and you think, what is going on? Everything's different. Was he following the same guy? Right? You can be honest. We're friends here. It's different. It's confusing. Shouldn't the story of Jesus be pretty standard? It's hard. And then you get Acts, which is the story of the growth of the church. And then the history part ends, and we get all these letters. They're not put in there in the order they were written. They're just grouped because Paul wrote these and other people wrote the other ones. And then, of course, Revelation. If you make it to Revelation unconfused, Revelation will do the job on it. There's, at every turn, start to finish, there are things that trip us up. You probably read books other than the Bible. I'm an avid reader. I've read some that switched point of view, or different characters told the story in each chapter, but they still all stayed in order. They didn't jump around and go different things. You don't usually have a novel where halfway through it switches from telling the story to something historical, and then someone writes a song. It's usually the same genre in one book. This is hard. But it's definitely worth figuring out. I think we can all agree on that. It's worth understanding. Because once we see the story, and you heard just a few brief testimonials from people, even Episcopals, goodness, that was funny, wasn't it? Getting a grasp, even for people who are on the ministry team, they're just like, this opened up so much for me. And so again, I want to reiterate something that was printed, that was on the screen briefly. what we're doing, the story, this version of events, this isn't meant to, like, throw out your Bible and use this instead. This is a gateway. It's the gateway. This is to get a better grasp on the bigger picture so that we can make better sense when we go back to the full biblical text. And so we are taking parts of the Bible and trying to put them in order in the kind of way that most of the stories we read were organized. And so we just want to see God's mural. We want to get a good, solid glimpse of how it all lays out. And that is going to make us, better biblical scholars. It'll most likely drive us back to the scriptures to learn more and more. But this isn't like every metaphor breaks down at some point. It's not the kind of mural that you pull up a chair and you just sit and look at. The Bible is not a work of art to just be admired from afar. Because one thing that we need to really understand is that the story's not over. Because Revelation is about the end of the world. I'm fairly certain that hasn't happened yet. Right? So that means the story isn't over. And that also means we're in it. We're characters in the same story that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were in. We encounter the same God that Moses encountered. We can be empowered by the same God that took a stubborn, hot-headed fisherman and made him one of the great leaders of the early church. That's our God. We're characters just like them in the same story. I'm getting chills thinking about it. It is mind-blowing to think that we're part of that story. And again, you don't have to believe that it's true. God's reality doesn't depend on whether we agree to it or not. Whether you even believe in the Bible or not, you are part of the story because this is God and humanity. And that's all of us. So we don't really get a choice whether we are going to be in the story or not. We just get to choose what kind of character we're going to be. Oh, that's juicy, isn't it? I enjoy movies and television and books and all that. I've got a fertile imagination. So I often think, wow, wouldn't that be cool to be in that situation? What would I have done in X, Y, or Z? And we really get to do that. I think what we want to make sure we do is don't be a throwaway character, like the extras. And some people are extras and they have a great time, and that's fine. But we don't want to be the one that the camera pans by on the way to the real story, right? And people who are getting started in Hollywood, they'll call their parents and be like, okay, you got to watch. When so-and-so walks into the restaurant, I'm person number 3 sitting at the table right by the door. I don't have to make this stuff up. And we had friends, their son went out to Hollywood, and he calls them, and he's like, they're going to run by, I'm the dead body in the middle, it's like Law and Order or something. Watch, I'm that dead body. And that's, if you're breaking into acting, you do whatever they ask you to do. But in God's story, do you want to be somebody that the camera just pans right by? The bit part, the extra, person number 3? I don't think that's what God wants for our lives. I don't think that's what we want. We want to play a part that matters. And we're not going to do Moses-level stuff, but we don't have to. Everybody has their part. And changing one person's life is important. And we can do that. We might not free all of the people from slavery or challenge a modern-day Pharaoh, but reaching out to somebody and showing love to them or helping them connect to God, that's life-changing. And that's worth being in on. So people who learn that the story's going on, that good and evil are battling, and that it will end at the end of time, People who look at that and say, I think I'm going to stay out of this. In a movie, the character who says, I just can't get involved, I don't want to be involved, they're always going to show up at the critical juncture and save the day. That's how movies work, right? I've seen it 100 times. That's not what happens in real life. In real life, if you decide to sit out the story, all it does is determine that you'll be on the wrong side of the fence when the sheep and goats are sorted. That's all. There's no real playing it safe in this story. Really, it boils down to protagonists and antagonists. Do we have any English teachers in the house? How you like that for some literature application? There's the side of good, and there's the side of evil. And God uses everybody to tell his story. Now, I think about, I grew up on all the really cheesy 80s action flicks, but I was thinking, what if buff old Arnold Schwarzenegger had gotten on his commando outfit and put on his grease paint to go and catch the guy who kept stealing his newspaper? Nobody shows up to that movie. If Sylvester Stallone gets his big giant knife, every kid wanted one of those knives when I was young, puts on his bandana and says, I'm not paying this fine, you mean librarian. Nobody's going to go see that. The good stories, the stories that are worth sticking through, that make you want to kind of be a part of it, those are the epic struggles between good and evil. You have to have an overwhelming, powerful villain to make it interesting. Now, unfortunately, we've got the ultimate villain going on here. The embodiment of evil is the antagonist here in this case. And we can't beat him by being super strong or saying cheesy one-liners as we destroy bad guys. The devil cannot be beaten by our power. And we can see him rearing his head throughout the story, trying to move things in the wrong way, sometimes impacting God's people. The ones who think they're the protagonists end up making messes of things. You know that. Sometimes he calls in his evil goons, like the Philistines. They're just bad guys. They probably, wore black costumes. But some of the bad guys thought they were on God's side. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? But we look at these characters. You've got Paul, who started off as an awful, arrogant antagonist, an enemy of God, who was 100% sure he was right and that he was doing what God wanted. But his willingness to change allowed God to make him a great hero. You may think about Sarah. She might be a lot like some of us. Sarah was 100% on board with God's plan, but when he starts saying what she's going to do, she laughs. Yeah, right. Oh my God. Think about Moses. I relate a lot with Moses. He did everything he could to just be a bit part. He tried everything in the book to stay out of the story. But ultimately, he allowed God to use him. And I don't want any of us to fight God quite as hard as Moses did, but I think sometimes we're reluctant to step up when God is calling. And I don't think God looks at us sometimes and says, I'll just let him. I don't think that happens. I think if we're part of the team, then God uses us. And I think sometimes we feel, maybe it's a nudge, maybe we hear a voice. God speaks to us in a lot of ways. And I think sometimes we know what he wants us to do, and we're just like, God, come on. Me? Really? I don't talk so good. They won't listen to me. I'm just a normal person. I live in this little out of the way place called Urbanna. I don't think the story even knows Urbanna is here. But I think God can take any of us, even in Urbanna, even in the middle of Middlesex County. I think he can take people and do amazing things. And guess what? If you've been hanging around here the last couple of years, you've been part of some amazing things. Maybe going back farther than that. I wasn't here, I don't know. If you've been part of our missions work in any capacity, you have been a part of amazing things that have reached people all over the world. If you've been part of our prayer ministry, you have seen miracles in response to our prayer. I mean, people come and find us because they know. They've heard. Word gets around. We've been part of amazing things. Even if you've just been here and part of this family, the kind of place where people walk in the door and are like, I've never been here, but I feel like I'm home. That's amazing. And you've been part of it. So let's not think we're automatically extras or bit parts just because we live in an out-of-the-way place. That's not true. There was this great movie. This was like making fun of action movies. And this kid who's like his life is watching the great action heroes in the theater, and he gets magically sucked into a movie. Yeah. But it's funny because you start seeing all of the stereotypical things, all of the tropes that they trot out in every single 80s action movie. And the kid's like, oh yeah, this is great. That always happens. Oh, I knew that was going to. Well, then there's this critical moment, and he's facing down the bad guys, and they're roaring at him in their, appropriately aggressive-looking sports car, and he's on a bike, and they're going head to head. He's like, I can't lose this. I'm a good guy. Good guys never die. We always miraculously escape. This is going to be fine. He's pedaling fast, and then they're getting closer. And then he says, wait a minute, what if I'm the comic relief? And he starts getting a little shaky, and then he's like, I might be the sidekick. Sidekicks are expendable. And he roars right off the road. It's a pretty funny movie. But here's the thing. We sometimes get distracted, or maybe even worried. We start thinking, maybe my part's not important enough. What is my role anyway? I'm not sure where I fit in. But it's not that complicated for us. We just need to decide, are we on God's side or not? See, that's pretty easy, isn't it? It's a simple choice. There's only two sides. Moses got caught up in all of the reasons he was the wrong choice. And his resume, it was a mess. He's like, I've been living out in the wilderness. I'm really only good with sheep at this point. Don't talk so good. I'm a murderer. I'm a fugitive from the law. My own people don't really like me much. And God's response was, terrible resume, but you forgot the last line. I'm with you. Good enough. Right? None of the other stuff mattered. All that mattered was God was with him. And if God is with us, which he is, if we choose his side, nothing else matters. And I'm pretty optimistic. This doesn't apply to anyone here, but I've got to cover my bases. Some people choose to be on the other side. They just say, I'm against God. I'm not going to follow him. I don't want his will to be done. And guess what? They are part of the story too. Remember Pharaoh? Did God use Pharaoh to tell his story? Now, I really don't want any of us to glorify God's power that way, but he'll use us one way or the other. You hearing me here? And I'm telling you, Pharaoh learned and illustrated for everyone who was there the power of God. And God says to him, he says, Pharaoh, for this reason I raised you up, put you on that throne, so you can come to know my power and my name might be proclaimed throughout the earth. That was his purpose. God took an antagonist and put him in position where he could show just how powerful God was. And our VBS crew can give me a little amen on this. The kids, when we're telling the story of Pharaoh and Moses and the plagues and everything, and just his sheer stubbornness, after a few plagues, the kids, a bunch of youngsters are just like, how dumb is this guy? How can he be so stubborn? And then, we'd say, and then Pharaoh said that they could leave. And they'd be like, he's lying. We know he's lying. No, kids laugh at Pharaoh's stupidity now. He's part of the story. God used him. And if we really dive into the story, we will see just how powerful God is. We will see that even when the antagonists try to change the story, it moves on. Even when the good guys, some of the heroes, make real messes of things, right? They try to speed things up or make sure that God's plan gets done the right way. God's story cannot be stopped. And Esther came to mind. This is a great example. And thinking of us, each of us is in a place. We're in a position, whether in our family, community, people that we know, we are the right person in the right place for something, somewhere, somebody. We just are. Esther happened to be in a really prominent position, perfect time and place to save her people. This was a big job. But remember, the Bible tells us she was the one on the line. It wasn't like she could just decide to sit out and everything would be fine. Her mentor said, look, God's going to save his people one way or the other. You just decide if you're going to be part of it or if you're going to doom yourself and your family. That's all that's happening here. God's plan is moving forward. And so we'll see over and over the protagonists and the antagonists. And I want us to be on the right side of that story. So let's think about the roles we're playing, who we're going to be. He takes normal people, often people who have no qualifications, and a lot of times people who are very aware they have no qualifications. And he says, that doesn't matter. I'm with you. Let's do this. We just have to say, hey, I'm in. That's all we have to do. We've got his power. We've got his words to speak. It's all there. And then if there's success, everybody knows it was God. We don't ever want people to say, oh, wow. Well, they got that done because they're a bunch of smart people. Whatever we accomplish, it's by the power of God. That's why we're here. We want God to get all the credit. We want to have stories to tell. And, spoiler alert, this happens late in the story. It's a twist that some people didn't see coming. But Jesus already ended the battle between good and evil. If people had really been watching, they would have seen it coming. You know, like in A Beautiful Mind, at the end you realize all of these different characters only existed in his brain. And I did that. Of course, I went back and had to watch the movie again because I was like, how did I miss it? Oh, yeah, when the girl runs around, the birds don't even jump up and fly away when she goes by. I should have seen it. If you look through the Old Testament story, all the clues are there. God started telling the people that Jesus was coming years and years and years ahead of time. He called his shot. And Jesus broke the power of death and cleared the way for us to have a really good ending to our story that the law could never have given us. And I ask my deacons to come join me now. We're going to celebrate this part of the story. Jesus took the bread and he passed it to them. He said, "This is my body, broken for you. As often as you eat of this, do it in remembrance of me." Jesus said, "This is my blood, shed for you. Drink this in remembrance." Well, I, for one, am really happy that we get to play out our parts in the story together. And hey, you better believe Urbanna Baptist Church shows up in the official documents of the story. You better believe it. Let's celebrate our Christian community here by closing with "Blessed Be the Tie." Let's stand. Our tradition is all to hold hands and try. Can't make a circle really, but we can at least all be connected.